On a rain-soaked evening in downtown Riverside Heights, Elena Ruiz was rushing home from her second job at the all-night diner when she spotted what looked like a homeless man collapsed on the sidewalk outside the old Meridian Bank building. Without a second thought, she dropped her worn purse and rushed to help, immediately beginning CPR on the unconscious stranger, whose expensive watch she didn't notice in the dim streetlight. Elena had no idea she was saving the life of Alexander Sterling, one of the most powerful tech billionaires in the country, who had been conducting a secret social experiment to test whether anyone would still help a stranger in need. What Alexander Sterling decided to do next would transform the life of this struggling single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep her family afloat. The question is, how far would a billionaire go to reward true human compassion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The shrill beeping of Elena's second-hand alarm clock pierced through the thin walls of the cramped 2-bedroom apartment at 4:45 a.m. just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Elena Ruiz's weathered hand reached out from beneath the threadbare comforter, silencing the noise before it could wake her 10-year-old daughter Sophia, who was curled up in the next room. In the gray pre-dawn light filtering through curtains that had seen better days, Elena could make out the familiar outline of their modest home in the Willowbrook housing complex. The second-hand furniture was arranged with the kind of careful attention that spoke of someone making the most of very little. A stack of overdue bills sat on the small kitchen counter, held down by a coffee mug with a crack running down one side. The refrigerator was covered in Sophia's colorful drawings and honor roll certificates that somehow made their tiny space feel warmer, despite the constant worry that gnawed at Elena's chest. Elena sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, running her hands through dark hair that was showing premature streaks of silver despite her 32 years. Her body ached from yesterday's triple shift, 6 hours cleaning offices at Pinnacle Tower before dawn, 8 hours as a teaching assistant at Riverside Elementary, then another 6 hours serving tables at Moonlight Diner until past midnight. The routine was exhausting, but it was what kept them afloat in a city where the cost of living seemed to rise faster than her paychecks ever could. "Mommy?" came a soft voice from the doorway. Sophia stood there in her favorite pajamas, purple ones with cartoon stars that Elena had found at the thrift store 3 months ago. The fabric was starting to fade, but Sophia treasured them because they reminded her of the bedtime stories Elena told about wishes coming true if you were brave enough to help others. "Buenos dias, mi amor," Elena said, opening her arms wide. Sophia patted across the cold linoleum floor and climbed onto her mother's lap, her small arms wrapping around Elena's neck. For a moment, the world felt manageable again. In these quiet morning minutes before the day's struggles began, Elena could almost pretend that her ex-husband Miguel's promises about sending child support might actually materialize, or that her applications for better-paying jobs might finally get responses. "Did you sleep okay?" Elena asked, smoothing down Sophia's tangled brown curls that were so much like her own. "I dreamed about Abuela again," Sophia said matter-of-factly, the way children do when discussing profound things that adults struggle to understand. "She was making empanadas, and she said to tell you that good things come to people who never stop caring about others." Elena felt her throat tighten. Her mother had passed away 2 years ago, just 6 months after Miguel had abandoned them, leaving Elena to face the world alone with a grieving 8-year-old and mounting debts from her mother's medical treatments. Even in death, it seemed, her mother was still trying to take care of them both. "That sounds exactly like something Abuela would say," Elena managed, kissing the top of Sophia's head. "How about we make some breakfast? Not empanadas, but I think we've got enough eggs for scrambled." Their morning routine unfolded with the practiced efficiency born of necessity. Elena prepared a simple breakfast while Sophia got dressed for school, their conversation flowing easily despite the early hour. Sophia chattered about her upcoming presentation on community heroes, how her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had praised her reading improvement, and whether they could afford to get art supplies for a Mother's Day project next week. "We'll see about the art supplies," Elena said, the same careful response she gave to most of Sophia's requests these days. It wasn't a no, but it wasn't a yes either. It was the diplomatic answer of a mother who'd learned to navigate between hope and harsh financial reality. as they shared their eggs at the small kitchen table, the same table where Elena's mother had taught her to make tortillas, where Sophia had taken her first steps, where Elena counted bills by lamplight after Sophia went to bed. Elena watched her daughter's animated face and marveled at her resilience. Sophia had been only 8 when life had stripped away their stability, yet she'd adapted with a grace that humbled Elena daily. The faded family photo tucked in Elena's purse seemed to pulse with memory as she reached for her coffee. In it, Elena held newborn Sophia while Miguel looked on with what she'd thought was love, but now recognized as the restless expression of someone already planning his escape. Her mother stood behind them, her weathered hands on Elena's shoulders, her eyes sparkling with the joy she found in simple family moments. "Mommy, you're doing that thing again," Sophia said gently, her small hand covering Elena's larger one on the table. "What thing?" "The worry face. Your eyebrows get all scrunched up when you're thinking about money stuff." Elena forced a smile, amazed by her daughter's perceptiveness. "Sorry, amor. Just thinking about the day ahead." After walking Sophia to Riverside Elementary, a routine Elena cherished despite it making her late for her first job more often than she'd like to admit, Elena caught the 6:15 bus to downtown Riverside Heights. The 45-minute ride took her from their working-class neighborhood through increasingly affluent areas until she reached the gleaming financial district, where she cleaned offices in buildings she could never afford to work in. Pinnacle Tower rose 37 floors into the morning sky, its glass facade reflecting the wealth and success that felt as distant to Elena as the stars Sophia loved to count from their apartment window. Inside, Elena lost herself in the rhythm of vacuuming, dusting, and emptying trash bins, her mind wandering as her body performed the familiar motions. She thought about Sophia's parent-teacher conference next week, the overdue electric bill that had arrived yesterday, and whether she could pick up an extra shift at the diner to help catch up on expenses. The work was invisible to the executives who would arrive hours later, but Elena took pride in leaving each office spotless, just as her mother had taught her to find dignity in any honest work. During her brief break between jobs, Elena sat on a bench outside the elementary school, eating a peanut butter sandwich and drinking coffee from a thermos her mother had given her years ago. Other parents talked about vacation plans and weekend activities that involved expenses Elena couldn't afford. She listened with half an ear, more focused on calculating whether the tips from last night's diner shift would cover Sophia's school lunch account. "You holding up okay, Elena?" asked Carmen, another teaching assistant whose children had grown up with Sophia in the same neighborhood. "You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." "Just the usual juggling act," Elena replied with a shrug. "Nothing that can't be handled." It was a lie they both recognized, but neither challenged. Pride was sometimes all a person had left, and Carmen understood that better than most. The afternoon at Riverside Elementary flew by in a whirlwind of helping students with reading, organizing classroom supplies, and assisting Mrs. Patterson with lesson preparations. Elena loved working with the children, seeing herself in the ones who struggled, celebrating with those who succeeded. It was the one job that felt like more than just survival. It felt like purpose. As the school day ended, Elena watched Sophia climb into the after-school program van with a mix of gratitude and guilt. The program was free, staffed by volunteers, and populated by children whose parents worked multiple jobs or struggled to make ends meet. Sophia thrived there, having made friends with kids who understood that sometimes dinner was cereal and that birthdays might be celebrated with homemade cake instead of store-bought. "See you at home, Mommy," Sophia called through the van window, her smile bright enough to power the entire city. Elena's final job began at 6 p.m. at Moonlight Diner, a 24-hour establishment in the older part of downtown, where the coffee was strong, the tips were modest, and the customers ranged from late-shift workers to insomniacs, seeking refuge from their thoughts. Elena had been working there for 18 months, and her steady, compassionate service had earned her regular customers, who specifically requested her section. Tonight felt different somehow, heavier with the kind of anticipation that made Elena check her phone more often than usual. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen, though she couldn't imagine what that might be. As she refilled coffee cups and took orders, her mind kept drifting to Sophia's upcoming presentation about community heroes, wondering what her daughter would say about the ordinary people who made extraordinary differences in small, quiet ways. Little did Elena know that in just a few hours, Her own definition of heroism would be tested in a way that would change not just her life, but her understanding of how kindness could ripple outward in ways she never imagined possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Part 2. Character Depth and Noble Qualities. The dinner rush at Moonlight Diner was in full swing when Elena noticed the elderly man in booth 7 hadn't touched his soup in over an hour. While her other tables demanded refills and rushed orders, something about his slumped posture caught her attention. During a brief lull, she approached with fresh coffee and a gentle smile. "How's everything tasting, sir?" she asked, noting the tremor in his weathered hands as he reached for his water glass. "Oh, it's fine, dear," he said, though his voice carried the hollow tone of someone trying to convince himself. "I'm just taking my time." Elena's trained eye, honed by years of watching her own mother struggle with pride versus need, recognized the signs immediately. The careful way he portioned his soup, making it last. The worn but clean clothes that suggested dignity, maintained despite hardship. The way he counted coins on the table when he thought no one was looking. "You know what?" Elena said conspiratorially, glancing around as if sharing a secret. "The kitchen made way too much cornbread tonight. My manager hates waste. Would you be doing us a favor by taking some off our hands? No charge, of course." The man's eyes brightened with understanding and gratitude. "Well, if it would help you out." Elena returned with a generous portion of cornbread wrapped in a clean napkin, along with extra butter packets. "Thank you so much for helping us out," she said, her tone making it clear that he was doing them the favor. This wasn't unusual behavior for Elena. 2 weeks earlier, she'd quietly paid for a young mother's meal when the woman's card was declined, claiming the diner was running a, quote, new parents special. Last month, she'd spent her break walking Mrs. Chen from the flower shop to the bus stop during a thunderstorm, ensuring the elderly woman made it home safely. "Elena's got the biggest heart in this place," said Marcus, the night cook, as she returned to the kitchen. "Yesterday I saw her give her own lunch to that homeless veteran who comes by. Told him the sandwich was going to expire anyway." "She reminds me of my daughter," added Betty, the veteran waitress who'd been working at Moonlight for 15 years, always thinking about everyone else before herself. "But Elena works harder than anyone I've ever seen. 3 jobs, raising that beautiful little girl on her own, and still finds energy to care about strangers." Elena's reputation extended beyond the diner. At Riverside Elementary, she was known for staying late to help struggling students with their reading, never accepting payment despite her own financial pressures. Teachers often found their classrooms mysteriously restocked with supplies that Elena had purchased with her tip money, though she always deflected credit when asked. "Miss Elena helped me understand fractions," 8-year-old Tommy had told his mother just last week. She said, "Sometimes things that look broken can still make something whole if you put them together right." The children gravitated toward Elena's warmth and patience. She had a gift for explaining difficult concepts in ways that made sense to young minds, often drawing from her own experiences of making do with less, to help them understand that intelligence wasn't about having the right materials. It was about finding creative solutions. During her cleaning shift at Pinnacle Tower, Elena's character shone through in different ways. While other cleaning staff rushed through their tasks, Elena took time to water the dying plants in neglected offices, straighten family photos that had been knocked askew, and leave encouraging notes for stressed executives who worked impossibly long hours. "Someone keeps leaving these little motivational quotes on my desk," investment banker Sarah Rodriguez had mentioned to her colleagues. "They always seem to appear on my worst days. It's like someone actually cares about the people who work here." Elena's supervisor Janet Walsh had noticed too. "In 20 years managing cleaning crews, I've never seen anyone who takes such personal interest in their work. Elena doesn't just clean offices, she brings humanity to these sterile corporate spaces." Last week I found her consoling that young intern who was crying in the bathroom about her student loans. The young intern, Ashley Chen, later told her roommate, "This cleaning lady, Elena, she just sat with me and listened. Didn't try to fix anything or give me advice I couldn't afford to follow. Just reminded me that struggling doesn't mean failing, and that every hard day is building character for better days ahead." At home in Willowbrook Housing Complex, Elena's neighbors had learned to depend on her quiet generosity. She translated documents for Mrs. Rodriguez, whose English was limited. She watched the Patterson children when their mother had to work late. She organized informal food sharing among families when anyone was struggling more than usual. "Elena never asks for help, but she's always the first to offer it," said neighbor Maria Santos. "When my husband was in the hospital last year, she made sure Sophia and my kids walked to school together every day. She brought us dinner 3 times a week and never made it feel like charity. Always said she'd made too much and didn't want it to go to waste." Even Sophia, despite her young age, had inherited her mother's compassionate nature, largely through observing Elena's daily example. At school, Sophia was known for sharing her lunch with classmates who forgot theirs, for including lonely children in playground games, and for standing up to bullies with the kind of quiet courage her mother demonstrated every day. "Sophia Ruiz is exactly the kind of student every teacher hopes for," explained Mrs. Patterson to the school principal. "Not because her grades are perfect, though they're excellent, but because she has this innate understanding that kindness is more important than competition. She gets that from watching her mother." Elena's character had been forged through hardship but never hardened by it. When Miguel had left them with nothing but debt and broken promises, Elena could have become bitter. When her mother's medical bills had consumed their savings, she could have despaired. When job applications were ignored and opportunities seemed closed to someone without a college degree, she could have given up. Instead, she'd chosen to see each challenge as an opportunity to model resilience for Sophia. Every early morning, every late night, every moment of choosing grace over grievance was a lesson in how to face adversity without losing your humanity. "My mommy says that being poor in money doesn't mean being poor in spirit," Sophia had written in a school essay about heroes. "She says when you help other people, you remember that everyone is fighting battles you can't see, and that makes your own battles feel less heavy." This philosophy guided Elena through her darkest moments. When the electricity was turned off last winter, she'd turned it into an adventure, teaching Sophia to read by candlelight and telling stories about how families throughout history had found warmth in each other when the world felt cold. When Sophia outgrew her shoes faster than Elena could afford new ones, they decorated the worn sneakers with markers and called them custom designs. "Elena has this way of taking difficult situations and finding something beautiful in them," observed Father Miguel at St. Catherine's Church, where Elena volunteered in the food pantry every Sunday despite working 6 days a week. "She doesn't just serve meals. She remembers names, asks about family members, makes everyone feel seen and valued. She transforms charity into community." As Elena finished her shift at Moonlight Diner that fateful evening, wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers for the morning crew, she had no idea that her years of quiet kindness had been noticed by more people than she could imagine. Her character had created ripples of goodness throughout Riverside Heights, from the children she helped learn to read, to the elderly customers she treated with dignity, to the neighbors who'd learned from her example that generosity wasn't about what you could afford to give, but about recognizing the humanity in everyone you met. The rain had started falling as Elena gathered her things, but she smiled anyway. Tomorrow would bring another early morning, another juggling act of 3 jobs and single parenthood, another day of choosing hope over hardship. She had no way of knowing that her most important test of character was waiting for her just outside the diner's front door, where a man who'd spent months searching for genuine human kindness was about to discover it in the most unexpected way. Elena's purse held exactly $23.47 in tips, a grocery list written on the back of a receipt, and a crayon drawing Sophia had made of their family. 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with "M.I. Mommy, S.M.I. Hero" written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. As she stepped into the rain, Elena Ruiz had no idea she was about to become someone else's hero in a way that would change both their lives forever. The rain was coming down harder as Elena stepped out of Moonlight Diner at 12:47 a.m., pulling her thin jacket tighter against the October chill that seemed to cut right through the worn fabric. The streets of downtown Riverside Heights were mostly empty at this hour, save for the occasional taxi splashing through puddles and the distant hum of the all-night convenience store on the corner. Elena's bus wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes, and she huddled under the narrow overhang of the diner's entrance, counting the day's tips and mentally calculating whether she had enough for Sophia's field trip permission slip and the overdue library fine. The sound of labored breathing caught her attention first, a harsh, rasping wheeze that seemed out of place in the quiet night. Elena looked up from her small pile of crumpled bills, to see a figure slumped against the brick wall of the old Meridian Bank building across the street. In the dim glow of the streetlight, she could make out a man in what appeared to be several layers of mismatched clothing, his gray hair disheveled and matted, his body curled in on itself in a way that spoke of either sleep or something far more serious. Elena's first instinct was to look away. Her mother had always warned her about being too trusting, especially late at night in downtown areas where desperation could make people dangerous. But something about the man's stillness, the way his chest seemed to be struggling for each breath, triggered the same instinct that had led her to comfort crying children and check on elderly customers who seemed unwell. She crossed the empty street, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles as she approached the figure. Up close, she could see that what she'd taken from multiple layers of clothing were actually expensive fabrics. A cashmere overcoat that had been deliberately dirtied, designer jeans that had been artfully distressed, leather boots that probably cost more than Elena made in a month, but had been carefully scuffed to look worn. The details didn't register consciously. Elena was focused entirely on the man's face, which had taken on a grayish pallor that she recognized from her mother's final days. "Sir? Sir, are you okay?" Elena called out, kneeling beside him on the wet concrete. The man's eyes were closed, and when she gently touched his shoulder, there was no response. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and Elena could see a faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool night air. Elena's mind raced through the first aid training she'd received years ago when Sophia was a toddler, basic CPR certification that she'd maintained through free classes at the community center, knowing that, as a single mother, she might be the only adult available in an emergency. She pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but weak and thready, barely perceptible under her fingertips. "Can you hear me?" she asked, louder this time, gently shaking his shoulder. Still no response. Elena pulled out her phone to call 911, but the screen showed no signal. A common problem in this part of downtown where the tall buildings created dead zones. She looked around frantically, but the street was completely deserted, the nearest open business 3 blocks away. The man's breathing suddenly became even more labored, and Elena watched in horror as his chest stopped rising altogether. Without hesitation, she positioned herself beside him, tilting his head back to clear his airway and checking his mouth for any obstructions. Her hands shook as she placed them on his chest, fingers interlocked, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Elena counted aloud, the rhythm coming back to her from countless practice sessions on plastic mannequins. The concrete was hard and cold against her knees, and rain was soaking through her jacket, but Elena's focus was entirely on the man beneath her hands. Every compression was delivered with the same care she would have given Sophia, the same determination that had carried her through every impossible day of the past 3 years. After 30 compressions, Elena tilted the man's head back and gave 2 rescue breaths, watching for his chest to rise with each one. Still no spontaneous breathing. She resumed compressions, her arms already beginning to ache from the force required to push blood through his system. The rain was making everything slippery, and Elena had to adjust her position several times to maintain the proper leverage. "Come on," she whispered between compressions. "Come on, you have to stay with me. Someone is counting on you to come home tonight." Elena thought of Sophia, asleep in their small apartment, and imagined this man might have someone waiting for him too, a family member wondering why he hadn't returned, children who needed their father, a spouse who would be devastated by loss. For nearly 8 minutes, Elena continued the life-saving rhythm, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, checking for signs of consciousness, then starting again. Her shoulders burned, her knees were scraped raw against the concrete, and her jacket was completely soaked through, but she never considered stopping. This was someone's father, someone's son, someone's whole world, and Elena refused to let him slip away on her watch. Finally, the man coughed and gasped, his eyes fluttering open with confusion and pain. Elena immediately stopped compressions but kept her hands ready, watching his chest carefully to ensure he continued breathing on his own. His eyes, she noticed, were a startling blue-gray, and there was something about them that seemed incongruous with his disheveled appearance, an intelligence and alertness that spoke of education and privilege. "Easy, easy," Elena said gently as the man tried to sit up. "You just had some kind of medical episode. I need you to stay still until help arrives." She pulled out her phone again and was relieved to see 2 bars of signal. Her call to 911 was answered immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I have a man who stopped breathing, probably in his 50s. I performed CPR, and he's conscious now but still in distress. We're on Charter Street across from the old Meridian Bank building. Ambulance is en route, ETA 4 minutes. Is the patient alert and responsive? Elena looked down at the man, who was now staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and amazement. Yes, he's alert. Sir, what's your name? Can you tell me your name? The man opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he just nodded weakly and squeezed Elena's hand with surprising strength for someone who'd just been unconscious. The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing and lights flashing, illuminating the scene in stark red and white strobes. 2 paramedics jumped out and immediately took over, checking vital signs and asking rapid-fire questions about what had happened. Elena stepped back but remained close, answering their questions about how long he'd been unconscious and what interventions she'd performed. You did good work, said the lead paramedic, a woman about Elena's age with kind eyes and competent hands. That was textbook CPR. How long since you were certified? I take refresher courses every 2 years at the community center, Elena replied, watching as they prepared to load the man onto a stretcher. Is he going to be okay? Hard to say without tests, but you definitely gave him the best possible chance. If you hadn't found him when you did. The paramedic let the implication hang in the air. As they loaded the man into the ambulance, he turned his head toward Elena one more time. Their eyes met, and she saw something there that would stay with her for weeks afterward. A look of profound gratitude mixed with what seemed like surprise, as if he hadn't expected to encounter such kindness from a stranger. Thank you, he mouthed silently, his lips barely moving. Elena nodded and stepped back as the ambulance doors closed. Within moments, they were gone, leaving her alone on the empty street, with nothing but the memory of those striking blue-gray eyes and the knowledge that she'd helped save a life. The bus arrived 10 minutes later, and Elena climbed aboard with shaking hands, her clothes still damp and her knees stinging from the concrete. As downtown Riverside Heights passed by the rain-streaked windows, Elena had no idea that the man she'd just saved was Alexander Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics and one of the wealthiest individuals in the country. She had no way of knowing that what she'd assumed was a random medical emergency had actually been the culmination of a months-long social experiment, or that her actions had just proven something Alexander had begun to doubt existed in the modern world. All Elena knew was that she'd helped someone who needed help, just as her mother had taught her to do. As the bus carried her toward home and Sofia, Elena closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude that she'd been in the right place at the right time to make a difference in someone else's life. Elena's key turned quietly in the apartment door at 1:43 a.m., her movements deliberately careful to avoid the creaky floorboard that always woke Sofia. The small living room was dark except for the glow of the digital clock on the microwave, and Elena could hear her daughter's peaceful breathing from the bedroom they shared. She set down her purse on the kitchen counter next to Sofia's homework folder and noticed the glass of water Sofia had left out for her, a nightly ritual the 8-year-old had started months ago after declaring that hard-working mamas need extra hydration. Elena smiled despite her exhaustion and drank the water gratefully, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the evening's events. She changed out of her damp uniform into an old t-shirt and sweatpants, hanging her work clothes over the bathroom door to dry. In the mirror, she could see scrapes on her knees from kneeling on the concrete, and her jacket still smelled faintly of rain and the industrial soap from the diner's hand dispenser. As she settled into their shared bed, careful not to disturb Sofia's sprawled sleeping form, Elena's mind replayed the events on Charter Street. She wondered if the man had made it to the hospital safely, whether his family had been notified, if he was receiving the care he needed. The image of his blue-gray eyes kept returning to her. There had been something almost familiar about them, though she was certain they'd never met before. Sofia stirred as Elena pulled the covers up, automatically reaching out in her sleep to curl against her mother's side. Even unconscious, Sofia seemed to sense when Elena had experienced something significant. Elena stroked her daughter's hair gently, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of her child and the familiar routine of their nighttime closeness. "Thank you for keeping me safe tonight," Elena whispered into the darkness, uncertain whether she was addressing God, her deceased mother, or simply the universe that had placed her on that street corner at exactly the right moment. Consotis. Morning arrived too soon, with Sophia's enthusiastic voice announcing that she'd already gotten dressed and packed her backpack, because today was library day, and she wanted to return her books early to have more time browsing for new ones. Elena forced herself awake, her body protesting after only 4 hours of sleep, and began their usual morning routine with practiced efficiency. "Mommy, you look tired," Sophia observed over their breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. "Did something happen at work last night?" Elena considered how much to tell her daughter. Sophia was mature beyond her years, but Elena tried to shield her from worrying about things she couldn't control. "I helped someone who was sick," Elena said simply. "Sometimes that takes extra energy, even when it's the right thing to do." Sophia nodded with the wisdom of a child who'd grown up understanding that her mother's compassion was both a strength and sometimes a burden. "Like when you stayed late to help Tommy with his reading even though we needed to do grocery shopping?" "Exactly like that, M.I. Amor." At Riverside Elementary, Elena's first task was helping Mrs. Patterson prepare materials for the day's science lesson about the human circulatory system. As she organized worksheets showing how blood flowed through the heart and lungs, Elena found herself thinking about the compressions she'd performed the night before, how each push of her hands had manually moved blood through the stranger's body when his heart couldn't do it alone. "You seem distracted today," Mrs. Patterson commented during their planning break. "Everything all right at home?" "Just thinking about how connected we all are," Elena replied, holding up one of the circulatory system diagrams. "How sometimes one person's actions can literally keep another person's life flowing." Mrs. Patterson studied Elena's face with the perceptiveness of someone who'd spent 20 years reading between the lines of what students and parents didn't say directly. "That sounds like the wisdom of someone who's had a meaningful experience recently." Elena smiled but didn't elaborate. She'd learned long ago that some experiences were too personal to share immediately, too significant to diminish with casual conversation. Instead, she threw herself into her work with even more focus than usual, helping struggling students with extra patience and celebrating small victories with genuine enthusiasm. During lunch, Elena sat in the teacher's lounge with a peanut butter sandwich and the local newspaper someone had left behind. She found herself scanning the news section for any mention of medical emergencies or hospital admissions from the previous night, but there was nothing. The incident on Charter Street hadn't been newsworthy enough to warrant coverage, which somehow made Elena feel both relieved and slightly disappointed. She'd saved someone's life, but to the rest of the world, it was just another night in the city. "Reading anything interesting?" asked Carmen, settling into the chair beside Elena with her own modest lunch. "Just wondering if good deeds that happen in the dark count as much as ones that happen in the light," Elena replied thoughtfully. Carmen laughed. "Honey, the best good deeds usually happen when nobody's watching. That's how you know they're real." That afternoon, as Elena helped second graders sound out difficult words during reading time, she found herself thinking about the stranger's face in those final moments before the ambulance arrived. There had been something in his expression that went beyond simple gratitude, a kind of wonder, as if he'd witnessed something unexpected and profound. Elena had seen similar expressions on children's faces when they finally grasped a concept they'd been struggling with, that moment of recognition when the world suddenly made more sense. After school, Elena walked to her cleaning job at Pinnacle Tower with unusual energy despite her lack of sleep. The routine tasks felt meditative today: vacuuming carpets, dusting surfaces, emptying trash bins. She found herself humming softly as she worked, a melody her mother used to sing while doing household chores, about how every small act of care made the world a little brighter. "Hi, Fall." In the executive offices on the 23rd floor, Elena noticed a framed photograph on one of the desks showing a man with his arm around what appeared to be his elderly father. Something about the younger man's profile reminded her of the stranger from the night before, but Elena dismissed the thought as coincidence born of exhaustion. The executive offices of Pinnacle Tower were a world away from Charter Street, populated by people whose emergencies involved stock prices and merger deadlines, not life-or-death moments on rain-soaked sidewalks. Elena's supervisor Janet found her in the break room during their brief rest period, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee and staring out the window at the city lights below. "You seem different tonight," Janet observed, calmer somehow, but also more energized, like you've got some kind of secret. "Maybe I do," Elena said with a small smile. Maybe I learned something about myself last night that I didn't know before. Care to share? Elena considered the question seriously. I learned that when the moment comes to choose between your own comfort and someone else's life, the choice isn't really a choice at all. It's just who you are. Janet nodded slowly. Sounds like wisdom earned the hard way. As Elena finished her shift and prepared to head to Moonlight Diner for another long night of serving tables, she paused at the elevator bank where security monitors showed different views of the building's exterior. One camera covered Charter Street, where the old Meridian Bank building was visible in the distance. Elena stared at the screen for a moment, remembering the weight of the stranger's body beneath her hands, the rhythm of compressions that had brought him back to consciousness. The elevator arrived and Elena stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. Tomorrow would bring another early morning, another day of juggling multiple jobs and single parenthood. Sophia had a math test on Friday that she was nervous about, and Elena had promised to help her practice multiplication tables. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, and a dozen small responsibilities that made up the fabric of their carefully constructed life. But tonight, as Elena walked through the lobby of Pinnacle Tower toward the bus stop that would take her to her third job, she carried with her the knowledge that she'd made a difference in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or recognition. Somewhere in the city, a man was alive because Elena Ruiz had chosen compassion over convenience, action over apathy. She had no idea that in a private hospital room across town, Alexander Sterling was lying awake thinking about the woman who'd saved his life, wondering how to find her again, and beginning to formulate a plan that would change both their futures in ways neither could imagine. Elena's night of quiet heroism was over, but the consequences of her kindness were just beginning to unfold. The private suite at Riverside General Hospital's cardiac wing was a far cry from the standard rooms most patients experienced. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, while mahogany furnishings and artwork created an atmosphere more reminiscent of a luxury hotel than a medical facility. Alexander Sterling sat propped against Egyptian cotton pillows, his laptop balanced on the adjustable bed table, but for once in his 47 years, business emails couldn't hold his attention. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, chief of cardiology, had just finished explaining that his episode had been a carefully orchestrated test that had nearly gone catastrophically wrong. What Alexander had planned as a controlled simulation of cardiac distress, using a mild sedative and breathing techniques, had triggered an actual arrhythmia that could have killed him without immediate intervention. "You're incredibly fortunate that woman found you when she did," Dr. Hawkins said, reviewing his chart with the measured tone of someone who delivered both miraculous news and devastating diagnoses. "Your heart rate had dropped to dangerous levels, and you'd stopped breathing for nearly 2 minutes before she began CPR. Without her intervention, you would have suffered irreversible brain damage within 4 to 6 minutes. Alexander stared out the window at the city, where millions of people went about their daily lives, most of them passing each other with barely a glance. For 6 months, he'd been conducting his social experiment, appearing as a homeless person in different locations throughout Riverside Heights, to test whether genuine compassion still existed in an increasingly disconnected world. He'd been ignored, avoided, stepped over, and occasionally given spare change by people who kept their distance. But never, not once, had anyone stopped to provide actual help when he appeared to be in medical distress. Until Elena Ruiz. "Do we know anything about her?" Alexander asked Dr. Hawkins, though he suspected the answer would be limited. His security team had been positioned at a distance to ensure his safety during the experiment, but they'd been too far away to gather information about his unexpected rescuer. The paramedics mentioned she was a woman in her 30s, possibly a service worker based on her uniform, Dr. Hawkins replied. "She performed CPR with considerable skill and stayed until the ambulance arrived. Beyond that, I'm afraid I don't have details." Within an hour of Dr. Hawkins' departure, Alexander's personal assistant, Rebecca Chen, arrived with her usual efficiency, carrying a tablet loaded with preliminary information and a concerned expression that she tried to mask with professional composure. "Sir, I have to say that when your security team called to report you'd been taken to the hospital, it was the longest 10 minutes of my career," Rebecca said, settling into the leather chair beside his bed. "But I've initiated the search protocols as you requested." Alexander's search protocols were the result of his position as CEO of Sterling Dynamics, one of the most powerful technology companies in the world. His resources included private investigators, data analysts, and security specialists who could piece together information from multiple sources to create comprehensive profiles of individuals. It was the same capability he used for corporate due diligence, but this time the subject was the woman who'd saved his life. "What do we have so far?" Alexander asked, closing his laptop to give Rebecca his full attention. "Traffic cameras captured her leaving the scene," Rebecca began, swiping through images on her tablet. "We've identified her walking toward the Charter Street bus stop at approximately 1:15 a.m. Cross-referencing with public transportation records and the diner uniform visible in the footage, we believe she works at Moonlight Diner." The first clear image of Elena showed her in profile under a streetlight, her dark hair slightly disheveled from the rain, her expression thoughtful as she waited for the bus. Even in the grainy security footage, something about her bearing suggested dignity and strength, despite her obvious exhaustion. "The diner's employment records are confidential, but we're working through appropriate channels," Rebecca continued. "However, we've also identified her through other connections. The building management company for Pinnacle Tower provided employment records showing an Elena Ruiz works in their evening cleaning crew. Cross-referencing with school district databases, children of single parents often qualify for free lunch programs. We found a Sophia Ruiz, age 8, enrolled at Riverside Elementary." Alexander studied the information with the same analytical approach he brought to business decisions, but found himself lingering on the detail about the school lunch program. This woman who'd saved his life was working multiple jobs and still struggling to provide basic necessities for her daughter. "What about her background?" Alexander asked. "Family situation, financial status, character references?" Rebecca's research had been thorough. Elena Maria Ruiz, 32 years old, born and raised in Riverside Heights. Mother deceased 2 years ago after a battle with cancer. Significant medical debt remaining. Divorced from Miguel Santos approximately 3 years ago. No child support being received. Currently employed at 3 different locations: Pinnacle Tower Cleaning Services, Riverside Elementary as a teaching assistant, and Moonlight Diner as a waitress. The picture that emerged was of a woman who worked nearly 18 hours a day across 3 jobs just to make ends meet, yet had found the time and compassion to save a stranger's life without a moment's hesitation. "There's more," Rebecca continued, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she'd found something particularly significant. "Elena volunteers every Sunday at St. Catherine's Food Pantry, despite working 6 days a week. The church administrator described her as one of the most selfless people in our congregation. Additionally, her neighbors in the Willowbrook housing complex describe her as someone who regularly helps elderly residents with groceries and translation services." Alexander absorbed this information with growing amazement. Elena Ruiz wasn't just someone who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. She was someone whose entire life seemed dedicated to caring for others, despite facing significant personal challenges. Her supervisor at Riverside Elementary provided an interesting quote, Rebecca added, reading from her notes. "Elena has this remarkable ability to see potential in every child, especially the ones who struggle. She stays after hours without pay to help students with reading, and I've seen her quietly purchase school supplies for children whose families can't afford them." The clinical efficiency of the background check couldn't mask the emerging portrait of someone extraordinary. Alexander had spent months testing whether genuine human compassion still existed, encountering mostly indifference and superficial charity. Elena Ruiz hadn't just proven that compassion existed, she embodied it in every aspect of her life. "What about social media presence?" Alexander asked, curious about how Elena presented herself to the world. "Minimal," Rebecca replied. "A basic Facebook account with photos of her daughter and inspirational quotes, mostly in Spanish. No Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn profiles. She appears to prefer privacy over self-promotion." This detail struck Alexander as particularly telling. In an age where people documented every meal and manufactured moments of virtue for public consumption, Elena lived her values quietly, without seeking recognition or validation from others. "Sir," Rebecca said carefully, "I have to ask, what are you planning to do with this information? The legal team has expressed some concerns about potential complications if this becomes public knowledge that you were conducting social experiments involving deception." Alexander had been considering the same question since Dr. Hawkins had explained how close he'd come to dying. His original plan had been to identify acts of genuine kindness and possibly provide anonymous donations to the Good Samaritans who helped him. But Elena's situation felt different, more complex and deserving of a more meaningful response. "Schedule a meeting with the legal team tomorrow," Alexander said finally. "But also prepare a comprehensive review of Elena's situation. I want to understand exactly what challenges she's facing and what opportunities might be available to address them." "Are you considering direct intervention?" Rebecca asked. "I'm considering how to properly thank someone who saved my life," Alexander replied. "Someone who risked her own safety to help a stranger, and who continues to make her community better despite facing hardships that would break most people." As evening approached and the city lights began to twinkle outside his hospital window, Alexander found himself thinking not about quarterly earnings or market projections, but about Elena Ruiz returning home to her 8-year-old daughter after 3 exhausting jobs, probably never mentioning that she'd saved someone's life because that's simply who she was. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling felt humbled by another person's character. His experiment had been designed to test humanity. But Elena had inadvertently tested him, challenging his assumptions about what mattered and who deserved recognition in a world that often overlooked its quiet heroes. Tomorrow he would begin the process of finding Elena Ruiz, not as part of a social experiment, but as a man who owed his life to someone whose own life deserved to be transformed by the same kind of unexpected kindness she'd shown to a stranger on a rain-soaked street. The search for Elena had become something much more significant than corporate due diligence. It had become Alexander's chance to prove that gratitude could be as powerful as the compassion that had saved his life. The knock on Elena's apartment door came at 7:15 on a Wednesday evening, just as she was helping Sophia practice her multiplication tables at their small kitchen table. Elena frowned, checking the time on the microwave clock. They weren't expecting anyone, and Mrs. Rodriguez from next door usually called before stopping by. Through the peephole, Elena saw a woman in an expensive-looking navy suit standing in the hallway, holding what appeared to be a leather portfolio, and looking distinctly uncomfortable in the fluorescent lighting of the Willowbrook housing complex. "Can I help you?" Elena asked through the door, her hand instinctively moving to the chain lock. "Ms. Ruiz, my name is Rebecca Chen. I represent someone who believes you helped him recently, and he'd very much like to speak with you." Elena's mind immediately went to the stranger from Charter Street. She'd thought about him several times over the past few days, wondering if he'd recovered fully and whether his family had been notified. But the idea that he'd somehow tracked her down felt surreal and slightly unsettling. "I'm sorry, I don't understand how you found my address," Elena said, keeping the door chained but opening it enough to see Rebecca's face. The woman appeared nervous but sincere, and Elena noticed she was holding what looked like a handwritten envelope rather than official documents. "I know this is unusual, and I apologize for the intrusion," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a mix of professionalism and genuine uncertainty. "The gentleman I represent has been searching for you since Monday night. He asked me to deliver this letter personally and to assure you that he simply wants to express his gratitude properly." Sophia appeared at Elena's elbow, her math worksheet forgotten in favor of this unexpected visitor. "Mommy, who is the lady?" Elena glanced down at her daughter, then back at Rebecca. "Just give me a moment, sweetheart." She closed the door to remove the chain, her instincts telling her that, despite the strangeness of the situation, this woman didn't represent any danger. When Elena opened the door again, Rebecca stepped forward slightly but remained respectful of the threshold. "Ms. Ruiz, I understand your caution. What I'm about to tell you might sound difficult to believe, but the man you helped on Charter Street is Alexander Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics. He's been conducting a research project about human compassion, and your actions literally saved his life." Elena stared at Rebecca for several seconds, processing this information. Alexander Sterling was a name she recognized from newspaper headlines and business magazines in the Pinnacle Tower waiting areas, one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the country. The idea that she'd performed CPR on someone so prominent felt impossible. "I think you have the wrong person," Elena said slowly. "The man I helped was homeless, or at least appeared to be. He was dressed in old clothes and—" "That was part of his research," Rebecca interrupted gently. "Mr. Sterling has been testing whether people would help someone who appeared to be experiencing homelessness. You were the only person in 6 months of testing who stopped to provide actual assistance." Sophia tugged on Elena's shirt. "Mammy, what's CPR?" Elena absently stroked her daughter's hair while trying to wrap her mind around Rebecca's explanation. "You're saying he was pretending to be homeless? That his medical emergency was fake?" "The medical emergency became very real," Rebecca said quickly. "What started as a controlled test nearly killed him. Dr. Hawkins at Riverside General confirmed that without your immediate intervention, Mr. Sterling would have died. That's why finding you has been so important to him." Elena felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that she genuinely helped save someone's life, confusion about the deception involved, and growing concern about what this revelation might mean for her family's privacy and safety. "What does he want from me?" Elena asked directly. Rebecca offered the envelope she'd been holding. "He asked me to give you this letter, and he'd like to meet with you if you're willing." "There are no expectations or obligations, Ms. Ruiz. He simply wants to thank you properly, and to understand how he can express his gratitude in a meaningful way." Elena accepted the envelope with hesitation, her calloused fingers careful with the expensive paper. The envelope was addressed to Elena Ruiz in careful handwriting, and she could feel multiple pages inside. "Can I read this privately?" Elena asked. "Of course. Mr. Sterling suggested I wait downstairs in my car for 15 minutes in case you have immediate questions, but there's absolutely no pressure to respond tonight or at all." After Rebecca left, Elena sat at the kitchen table with Sophia beside her, both of them staring at the unopened letter as if it might contain something dangerous. "Is this about the sick man you helped?" Sophia asked with the directness that 8-year-olds brought to complex situations. "I think so, mi amor, but it turns out he might not be who I thought he was." Elena opened the envelope carefully and began reading aloud, translating the English into Spanish for Sophia's benefit. "Dear Ms. Ruiz, I am writing to you from my hospital bed, where I am recovering from what could have been a fatal cardiac episode. Thanks to your quick thinking and brave actions, I am alive to write this letter. I must begin with an apology for the deception that led to our encounter. For the past 6 months, I have been conducting what I believed was important research about human compassion in modern society. Disguised as a homeless person, I placed myself in various situations to test whether people would help someone who appeared to need assistance. The results had been disheartening. In 6 months of testing, hundreds of people passed by opportunities to help. Some ignored obvious distress, others actively avoided contact, and a few offered token gestures that required no personal risk or inconvenience. Then I met you." Elena paused in her reading, looking up at Sophia, who was listening with the intense concentration she brought to challenging school lessons. "He was testing people?" Sophia asked. "Like a quiz?" "Something like that, sweetheart. But it sounds like his test became real." Elena continued reading. "What began as a controlled simulation became a genuine medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Dr. Hawkins has informed me that I stopped breathing for nearly 2 minutes and would have suffered irreversible damage without your CPR. But Ms. Ruiz, the medical facts are only part of why I needed to find you. In researching your background, and I hope you'll forgive this intrusion, I've learned that you are exactly the kind of person I had begun to believe no longer existed. Despite working multiple jobs to support your daughter, despite facing financial hardships that would overwhelm most people, you chose to help a stranger without a moment's hesitation. Your actions have restored my faith in human goodness and reminded me that true character isn't determined by circumstances, but by choices." Elena felt her throat tighten as she read the next paragraph. "I am writing not to offer charity, which I suspect you would refuse, but to ask for the opportunity to express my gratitude properly. I would very much like to meet with you and Sophia to thank you both, because I understand that your commitment to helping others is something you've taught your daughter through your daily example. Please know that there are no expectations or obligations attached to this request. You saved my life, and I would like the chance to ensure that your own life reflects the goodness you've shown to others. With profound gratitude, Alexander Sterling." Elena set the letter down and noticed that Sophia was watching her face intently. "Mommy, why do you look sad? Isn't it good that you helped someone important?" Elena considered her daughter's question carefully. "I'm not sad, am I, amor? I'm just thinking about what this means for us." The truth was that Elena felt overwhelmed by the implications of the letter. Alexander Sterling represented a world of wealth and power that she'd never imagined intersecting with her own life. The idea of meeting someone so prominent felt both exciting and terrifying. But more than that, Elena was grappling with the ethics of Sterling's experiment. She understood his desire to test human compassion, but the deception involved troubled her. How many genuinely homeless people had passed through those same areas while Sterling conducted his research? How many people who might have needed real help had been overlooked, while attention focused on someone who was actually wealthy enough to afford any medical care he required? Elena looked around their small apartment, at Sophia's homework spread across the kitchen table, at the stack of bills she'd been avoiding, at the refrigerator covered with her daughter's artwork and honor roll certificates. This was their world, built through honest work and careful choices. The idea of that world intersecting with Alexander Sterling's felt like stepping into a story that belonged to someone else. "What are you going to do?" Sophia asked. Elena folded the letter carefully and looked at her daughter's expectant face. "I think I'm going to be very careful and very honest, and remember that doing the right thing doesn't change just because someone turns out to be famous." Outside, Rebecca Chen waited in her car, checking her phone for messages from Alexander Sterling, who was anxiously awaiting news of Elena's response. Neither of them could predict that Elena Ruiz was about to teach them both another lesson about integrity, this time about having the courage to speak truth to power. Elena spent 2 sleepless nights considering Alexander Sterling's letter before finally agreeing to meet with him, but only on her terms. She insisted the meeting take place at Riverside Community Center during Sophia's Saturday art class, a public location where she felt safe and which represented the community she actually belonged to. Rebecca Chen had seemed surprised by Elena's specific conditions, clearly expecting her to be more impressed by offers to meet at Sterling Dynamics headquarters or an upscale restaurant. The community center was a modest brick building that served as a hub for Willowbrook residents, offering everything from job training programs to senior citizen meals. Elena arrived early, sitting in the lobby where she could watch Sophia through the glass doors of the art room, carefully painting a landscape that she'd been working on for 3 weeks. The familiar sounds of children laughing and volunteers chatting in both English and Spanish felt grounding in a way that Elena suspected Sterling's corporate world wouldn't. Alexander Sterling arrived precisely on time, but Elena barely recognized him as the man she'd performed CPR on just a week earlier. Gone was the disheveled appearance and worn clothing. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena made in several months. His silver hair was neatly styled, and he moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. Yet, when he spotted Elena sitting near the children's artwork display, his expression softened into something approaching nervousness. "Ms. Ruiz," he said, extending his hand as he approached. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I wasn't sure you would." Elena shook his hand briefly, noting the softness of palms that had never performed manual labor. "Mr. Sterling, I have to admit, I'm still processing everything your assistant told me. It's not every day you discover you've saved someone who could probably buy this entire neighborhood." Alexander winced slightly at her directness, but Elena noticed he didn't attempt to deflect or minimize the wealth disparity between them. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the plastic chair beside her. "Of course, but before we talk about anything else, I need to understand something about your experiment." Elena's voice carried the same no-nonsense tone she used when dealing with difficult situations at work. "While you were pretending to be homeless for 6 months, how many actually homeless people were in those same areas? How many real emergencies happened that people might have ignored because they'd become desensitized to seeing someone like you?" The question clearly caught Alexander off guard. He'd prepared for gratitude, for requests, for the awkwardness of vast economic differences, but not for a moral challenge delivered with such quiet intensity. Alexander began, then stopped, recognizing that any defensive response would be inadequate. "I hadn't considered that possibility. My focus was entirely on testing whether compassion still existed, not on the potential consequences of the deception involved." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the entitled dismissiveness she'd encountered from wealthy customers at the diner who treated service workers as invisible. Instead, she saw what appeared to be genuine discomfort and the beginning of understanding. "The thing is, Mr. Sterling, compassion isn't something you can test like a scientific hypothesis. It's something you live every day, in small ways, with people who actually need help." Elena gestured toward the window where an elderly man was helping another resident with a walker navigate the front steps. "That's Mrs. Santos helping Mr. Garcia because his arthritis is bad today. She does it every Saturday, not because anyone's watching or because she'll get recognition, but because it's who she is. Alexander followed her gaze, and Elena could see him processing this perspective, that the compassion he'd been searching for existed all around him, but in forms too ordinary for his research methodology to capture. "You're right," he said quietly. "My experiment was designed by someone who lives in a world where human interaction is often transactional. I was looking for compassion in the wrong way, testing for it instead of simply recognizing it." Elena felt some of her defensiveness ease at his admission. "So what happens now? Your assistant mentioned gratitude, but I'm not sure what that means coming from someone in your position." Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder, much thicker than the letter Rebecca had delivered. "I've spent the past week learning about your life, Ms. Ruiz, and I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to understand how someone in your circumstances could still choose to help a stranger." Elena tensed slightly. The idea of being investigated, even with good intentions, felt invasive and presumptuous. "What I discovered," Alexander continued, "is that you work 18-hour days across 3 jobs, care for your daughter as a single mother, volunteer at your church, and help your neighbors regularly. You've created a life of service despite facing challenges that would overwhelm most people." "I do what I have to do," Elena said simply. "That's not special, that's just life." "But it is special," Alexander insisted. "And it's taught me something important about the difference between charity and opportunity. You don't need charity, Ms. Ruiz. You need what everyone deserves, the chance to use your talents in ways that provide security for your family." Alexander opened the folder and withdrew a document with the Sterling Dynamics letterhead. "I'd like to offer you a position with my company. Not as a token gesture or because you saved my life, but because someone with your character and work ethic represents exactly what Sterling Dynamics should value." Elena accepted the job description with skeptical curiosity. The title read Community Relations Coordinator, with responsibilities that included overseeing Sterling Dynamics' charitable initiatives, employee volunteer programs, and community partnerships. The salary listed was more than double what she currently made from all 3 jobs combined, with full benefits and opportunities for advancement. "This sounds impressive," Elena said carefully, "but I have no experience in corporate communications or community relations beyond volunteering at my church." "You have something more valuable than experience," Alexander replied. "You understand what communities actually need because you're part of one. You know how to connect with people because you see them as individuals rather than demographics. Most importantly, you have the integrity to tell me when I'm wrong, which is apparently something I need more of." Elena read through the job description more carefully, noting details about flexible scheduling to accommodate Sophia's school needs and professional development opportunities. It was clearly a real position with substantive responsibilities, not a ceremonial role created to assuage guilt. "Why should I trust this?" Elena asked directly. "How do I know this isn't just an elaborate way to make yourself feel better about your experiment? That you won't lose interest in 6 months and leave me without the jobs I had before?" Alexander met her gaze steadily. "Because everything I've learned about you suggests that you'll hold me accountable to treat this position with the seriousness it deserves. Because Sterling Dynamics needs someone who understands that corporate responsibility means more than writing checks. And because, frankly, I need someone in my organization who will challenge me to be better." Elena looked through the glass doors at Sophia, who was adding careful details to her painting with the intense concentration she brought to everything she cared about. The job would mean financial security, health insurance, a future that included possibilities, rather than just survival. But it would also mean entering a world she didn't understand, working for someone whose privilege had allowed him to turn human suffering into a research project. "I need time to think about this," Elena said finally, "and I need to understand what would happen if it doesn't work out. I can't afford to give up 3 steady jobs for one position that might disappear if you decide I'm not what you expected." "Of course," Alexander said immediately. "But Ms. Ruiz, I want you to know that this offer comes with a contractual guarantee. If for any reason the position is eliminated within the first 2 years, Sterling Dynamics will provide a severance package equivalent to 1 year's salary and assist with job placement elsewhere." Elena studied the man beside her, trying to reconcile the polished executive with the unconscious stranger she'd found on Charter Street. There was something genuine in his manner, a humility that seemed newly acquired but sincerely felt. "Mr. Sterling," Elena said slowly, If I take this job, you need to understand that I won't be grateful in the way you might expect. I'll work hard and do my best, but I won't pretend that your offer erases the problems with your experiment or that one act of kindness makes us friends." Alexander nodded solemnly. "I wouldn't want you to. I'm hoping you'll see this as an opportunity to do meaningful work that benefits your community, not as a personal favor to me." Elena folded the job description and placed it in her purse next to Sophia's permission slip for a field trip to the Science Museum. The contrast between her small, immediate concerns and the life-changing opportunity she was considering felt surreal, but somehow manageable. "I'll have an answer for you by Monday," she said, standing as Sophia's art class began to wrap up. "But Mr. Sterling, if I take this position, it won't be because you're grateful. It'll be because I believe I can do some good with it." Alexander stood as well, and Elena noticed that despite his expensive clothing and polished appearance, he looked somehow smaller than he had moments before, as if her conditional acceptance had humbled him in a way that his near-death experience hadn't quite managed. "That's exactly why I hope you'll say yes," he replied quietly. Elena's first day at Sterling Dynamics began at 8:30 a.m. on a crisp Monday morning in November, 3 weeks after her meeting with Alexander Sterling at the community center. She stood outside the gleaming 42-story headquarters building, watching streams of professionally dressed employees flow through the revolving doors with the confidence of people who belonged in this world of glass and steel. Elena smoothed her new navy blazer, purchased with Sophia's enthusiastic input from a department store they'd never shopped at before, and reminded herself that she'd earned this opportunity through her own actions, not through luck or charity. The lobby was an intimidating expanse of polished marble and contemporary art that probably cost more than most people's homes. Elena approached the security desk with her new employee credentials, noting how the guards' demeanor shifted from polite indifference to respectful attention when they saw Alexander Sterling's personal authorization on her paperwork. "Ms. Ruiz, welcome to Sterling Dynamics," said the head of security, a professional woman named Janet Torres, whose warm smile suggested genuine rather than obligatory friendliness. "Mr. Sterling asked us to ensure your first day went smoothly. I'll escort you to the 28th floor." The elevator ride felt endless, with Elena watching the digital floor counterclimb past apartments she'd only read about in business magazines. When the doors opened on the 28th floor, Elena found herself in a bright, open workspace that hummed with purposeful activity. Unlike the sterile corporate environments she'd imagined, this floor felt alive with collaboration and genuine enthusiasm. "Elena!" Rebecca Chen approached with the same professional warmth she'd shown at Willowbrook Housing Complex, but now Elena could see her in her natural environment, clearly a respected and capable executive in her own right. "I'm so glad you decided to join us. Let me show you around." Elena's office was modest but well-appointed, with a view of the city that included the Willowbrook neighborhood, where she'd lived just 3 weeks ago. On her desk sat a brass nameplate reading Elena Ruiz, Community Relations Coordinator, and a small potted succulent with a note from Sophia. "For good luck in your new job, Mommy. Don't forget to water it." "Your first project is already waiting," Rebecca explained, handing Elena a thick folder. "Sterling Dynamics has committed to a comprehensive community partnership initiative, and we need someone to design and implement programs that actually benefit the communities we claim to serve." Elena opened the folder to find preliminary research on potential partnerships with organizations she recognized, the same community centers, food pantries, and schools where she'd volunteered for years. But the corporate approach felt disconnected from the actual needs she'd witnessed firsthand. "This is interesting," Elena said carefully, "but some of these assumptions about what communities need seem based on theoretical research rather than actual experience. For instance, this proposal for computer literacy classes assumes that lack of technology access is the primary barrier, when often the real issue is finding time to attend classes when you're working multiple jobs." Rebecca paused in her orientation speech, clearly not expecting such immediate and specific feedback. "What would you suggest instead?" Elena thought of the mothers she knew from Sophia's school, women who juggled impossible schedules and responsibilities. Mobile programs that come to people where they already are. Evening childcare so parents can attend. Classes taught in both English and Spanish by instructors who understand the community's actual concerns, not just what we think they should want to learn. "That's actually brilliant," Rebecca said, making notes. "Mr. Sterling mentioned that you'd bring a different perspective. but I didn't realize how much we'd been missing. As the morning progressed, Elena met with various department heads who seemed genuinely curious about her background and ideas. Unlike the corporate dynamics she'd expected, hierarchy based on education and pedigree, she found people who were willing to listen to someone who brought real-world experience to theoretical problems. Her lunch meeting was with Dr. Sarah Martinez, Sterling Dynamics' head of corporate social responsibility, a woman in her 40s who'd built her career in nonprofit management before joining the corporate world. I have to admit, Elena, when Alexander told me he was hiring someone without traditional corporate experience, I was skeptical, Dr. Martinez said as they sat in the executive dining room. But after reading your analysis of our current community programs, I'm convinced we've been approaching this backwards. Elena had spent her weekend reviewing Sterling Dynamics' charitable initiatives and had been struck by their focus on high-visibility projects that generated positive publicity rather than addressing fundamental community needs. Food drives that provided canned goods instead of fresh produce, scholarship programs that required extensive documentation many families couldn't navigate, job training courses that prepared people for positions that didn't actually exist in their neighborhoods. The problem isn't ill intent, Elena replied. It's perspective. When you're making decisions about community needs from a conference room on the 28th floor, you're inevitably going to miss things that are obvious when you're actually living in those communities. Dr. Martinez leaned forward with interest. Such as? Transportation, for one. We offer job training downtown. But many participants can't afford reliable transportation to get here consistently. Childcare is another. Offering evening programs without providing childcare excludes most single parents. And then there's the assumption that people want to be grateful recipients rather than active partners in solutions. Elena thought of her neighbors at Willowbrook, people with decades of experience solving problems with creativity and resourcefulness, whose insights were rarely solicited by the organizations claiming to help them. What if instead of designing programs for communities, we designed them with communities? Elena suggested. What if we started by asking people what they actually need, and then figured out how to provide it, rather than deciding what we think they should want? The afternoon brought Elena's first team meeting, where she was introduced to 5 other coordinators responsible for different aspects of Sterling Dynamics community relations. Most had MBA degrees from prestigious universities and years of experience in corporate philanthropy. Elena felt the familiar imposter syndrome that had plagued her since accepting the position, but pushed through it by focusing on the work rather than her credentials. Elena, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the Henderson School District Partnership, said Marcus Kim, a coordinator who'd been with the company for 3 years. We're proposing a technology upgrade for their computer labs. Elena reviewed the proposal quickly, recognizing Henderson Elementary as a school similar to Riverside where Sophia attended. This is generous, but I'm wondering if we've asked the teachers what they actually need most. In my experience, schools often need basics before they can effectively use advanced technology. Things like reliable internet, teacher training, and technical support. We assumed the technology itself was the priority, admitted another coordinator, Jessica Walsh. Technology is only useful if teachers know how to integrate it into their curriculum and if the infrastructure exists to support it, Elena explained. Maybe we should start with a listening tour, actually visit these schools, talk to teachers and parents, understand their daily challenges before we decide how to help. The meeting continued with Elena offering similar perspectives on each initiative, consistently reframing corporate solutions in terms of community realities. She could see her colleagues processing this approach, some with enthusiasm and others with the polite resistance of people whose expertise was being gently challenged. At 4:30, Alexander Sterling appeared in the conference room doorway. "How's the first day going?" he asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than executive check-in. "Very educational," Elena replied honestly. "For everyone, I think." After the others left, Alexander sat down across from Elena. "Rebecca mentioned you've already identified some significant gaps in our current approach. I'm curious about your overall assessment." Elena considered her response carefully. "Mr. Sterling, your company clearly wants to make a positive impact, and the resources you're dedicating are substantial. But most of your programs are designed by people who've never experienced the problems they're trying to solve. It's well-intentioned, but it's also inefficient and sometimes counterproductive." Explain. "You're offering solutions to problems that don't exist while missing the ones that do." You're providing services that people can't access because you haven't considered the barriers. And you're maintaining a dynamic where communities are passive recipients rather than active partners, which doesn't build long-term capacity for change. Alexander nodded slowly. So what would you do differently? Elena pulled out the notebook where she'd been jotting ideas throughout the day. Start with listening. Real listening, not focus groups or surveys, but extended conversations with people who live in these communities. Build partnerships with existing community leaders rather than importing outside experts. Design programs that address root causes rather than just symptoms. And measure success by community outcomes, not corporate metrics. That sounds like a fundamental restructuring of our entire approach. It is, Elena said simply, but if you want actual impact rather than just good publicity, that's what it's going to take. Alexander was quiet for a moment, and Elena wondered if she'd been too direct, too challenging for someone still adjusting to having his worldview questioned. How long do you think such a restructuring would take, he asked finally. To completely overhaul? Probably 2 years to see significant results, longer to build sustainable community partnerships. And you'd be willing to lead that effort? Elena looked out her office window at the city below, thinking of Sophia doing homework at their new kitchen table in their new apartment, thinking of the neighbors still struggling at Willowbrook, thinking of all the communities that could benefit from corporate resources if those resources were deployed with wisdom rather than just good intentions. Mr. Sterling, I'd be honored to lead that effort, not because I owe you anything, but because it's the kind of work that could actually change people's lives. Alexander smiled, the first completely genuine expression Elena had seen from him since their community center meeting. Then let's change some lives, Ms. Ruiz. As Elena packed up her things at the end of her first day, she realized that accepting this position hadn't just changed her own circumstances. It had given her a platform to advocate for communities that rarely had their voices heard in corporate boardrooms. The brass nameplate on her desk represented more than personal success. It represented the possibility of bridging two worlds that had operated independently for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to translate community wisdom into corporate policy. Elena Ruiz was no longer just surviving. She was building something that could benefit everyone. 3 months into Elena's tenure at Sterling Dynamics, what had begun as a professional relationship with Alexander Sterling had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. It started with weekly progress meetings that gradually extended beyond scheduled times. Conversations that meandered from community partnership strategies to discussions about leadership, family, and the unexpected ways that life could redirect itself through single moments of human connection. Elena had transformed Sterling Dynamics' community relations approach with systematic thoroughness, implementing listening tours that brought corporate executives directly into the neighborhoods they claimed to serve. The results had been eye-opening for everyone involved. Marcus Kim had spent a morning at Riverside Elementary and returned to headquarters with a completely revised understanding of educational technology needs. Jessica Walsh had attended a community meeting in East Riverside and discovered that residents had already developed innovative solutions to problems Sterling Dynamics had been trying to solve from the outside. "You've fundamentally changed how we operate," Alexander told Elena during one of their extended evening conversations, this one taking place in his corner office as city lights began to twinkle below. "More importantly, you've changed how we think about our role in the community." Elena was reviewing partnership agreements with 3 community organizations, each one structured as true collaboration rather than charitable donation. "It's not revolutionary thinking, Mr. Sterling. It's just treating people as experts on their own lives instead of problems to be solved by outsiders." "Please, call me Alexander," he said, a request he'd made several times over the past month. "And I think you're underestimating the significance of what you've accomplished here." Elena looked up from her paperwork, noting the way Alexander's formal business demeanor had relaxed over the weeks they'd worked together. Gone was the nervous uncertainty she'd observed during their first meeting at the community center. In its place was someone who seemed genuinely at ease, more authentic than the polished executive she'd initially encountered. "Alexander," Elena said, testing the name, "what I've accomplished is finally being listened to by people with resources. The community leaders I'm working with have been developing these solutions for years. They just needed someone to convince corporate decision-makers to pay attention." Their conversations had begun, including personal elements that surprised them both. Alexander had shared stories about growing up as the son of Sterling Dynamics' founder, the pressure to prove himself worthy of inherited privilege, the loneliness that came with wealth that attracted friendship for the wrong reasons. Elena had talked about Sophia's dreams of becoming a doctor, her own fears about providing adequate opportunities for her daughter, the strength she'd inherited from her mother's example of facing hardship with dignity. "Can I ask you something personal?" Alexander said, setting down the quarterly report he'd been reviewing. "How do you maintain such optimism when you faced so many challenges? Most people who've experienced what you have would be bitter, or at least cynical." Elena considered the question seriously. "I think cynicism is a luxury I can't afford. If I start believing that people are fundamentally selfish, or that systems can't change, then I lose hope for Sophia's future. My optimism isn't naive, it's strategic. It's what allows me to keep working for better outcomes." These conversations often occurred after regular business hours, when the Sterling Dynamics offices had emptied and they could speak more freely. Elena had initially felt uncomfortable with the informal atmosphere, worried about appearances and professional boundaries. But Alexander's interest seemed genuinely focused on her ideas and perspectives, rather than anything inappropriate. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said one evening in December as they reviewed the year-end community impact report that Elena had compiled. "When I first started searching for you after the incident on Charter Street, I thought I was looking for someone to thank. But working with you these past months has made me realize I was actually looking for someone to learn from." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such direct appreciation. "You're giving me too much credit. I'm just doing my job." "No, you're doing much more than that," Alexander insisted. "You're teaching everyone here, including me, about integrity, about genuine service, about what it means to use privilege responsibly." The shift in their relationship became more apparent during Sterling Dynamics' annual holiday party, held in the company's executive conference center, with catering that probably cost more than many families spent on groceries in a year. Elena had initially planned to attend briefly and leave early, but Sophia had insisted on helping her choose an outfit, and had been excited about the possibility of meeting some of Elena's new colleagues. "Mommy, you look beautiful," Sophia had declared that morning, admiring Elena's simple black dress and the understated jewelry she'd borrowed from Carmen for the occasion. "Are you nervous about the fancy party?" "A little," Elena had admitted, "but I'm learning that fancy doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means more complicated." At the party, Elena found herself the center of attention in ways that felt both flattering and overwhelming. Colleagues who had initially seemed skeptical of her non-traditional background now sought her opinions on everything from community partnerships to corporate policy. Dr. Martinez introduced her to board members as the person who's revolutionized our community engagement strategy. Rebecca Chen made sure Elena met visiting executives from other companies who were interested in replicating Sterling Dynamics' new approach to corporate social responsibility. But it was Alexander's behavior that surprised Elena most. Rather than playing the role of commanding CEO, he consistently directed credit and attention toward Elena's work, highlighting her insights and accomplishments with obvious pride. When board member Patricia Young complimented the company's improved community relations, Alexander immediately credited Elena's leadership. "Elena has taught us that effective community partnership requires genuine humility," Alexander explained to a group of executives. "She's shown us the difference between charity and justice, between helping people and empowering them." Elena felt uncomfortable with such public praise, partly because she remained aware of the vast differences in their backgrounds and positions, and partly because Alexander's admiration seemed to go beyond professional appreciation. "You made me sound much more impressive than I actually am," Elena told Alexander during a quiet moment near the windows overlooking the city. "I made you sound exactly as impressive as you are," Alexander replied. "Elena, I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate, but these months of working with you have been the most meaningful of my professional life. You've challenged me to be better than I thought possible." Elena studied his face, noting the sincerity in his expression. "Alexander, I appreciate that, but I need you to understand something. My life is very different from yours. Sophia and I come from a world where security isn't guaranteed, and where trust has to be earned through consistent actions, not just good intentions." "I understand that," Alexander said quietly, "and I hope you know that my respect for you and Sophia isn't based on gratitude or guilt about our different circumstances. It's based on who you are as people." Their conversation was interrupted by Rebecca Chen, who approached with news that several community organizations had sent thank you letters specifically praising Elena's collaborative approach to the Winter Assistance Program. As Elena read the letters, filled with specific examples of how the new partnership model had provided more effective help to families in need, she felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. "Listen to this," Elena said, reading from a letter written by Father Miguel from St. Catherine's Church. "Instead of providing services to our community, Sterling Dynamics has finally learned to provide services with our community. Elena Ruiz has created partnerships that honor our residents' dignity and wisdom, while providing resources that address real needs." Alexander smiled as he listened to Elena read more testimonials, but his expression carried something deeper than professional satisfaction. Elena was beginning to recognize that, look, the way he watched her when she was passionate about her work, the pride he took in her successes, the genuine care he showed for her opinions and well-being. As the party wound down and Elena prepared to leave, Alexander walked her to the elevator with the kind of attentiveness that felt distinctly personal rather than professional. "Elena," he said as the elevator arrived, "I hope you know that you've become more than just a valued colleague. You and Sophia have become important to me in ways that have nothing to do with business." Elena felt her heart skip slightly at his honesty, but also felt the weight of caution that had protected her through years of single motherhood and financial insecurity. "Alexander, I need to think about what that means," she said carefully. "My priority will always be Sophia's stability and security. I can't afford to make decisions based on feelings that might change." "I understand," Alexander said immediately. "And I hope you know that my feelings aren't going to change. You've taught me what it means to care about something larger than myself, and that's transformed how I see everything, including how I see you." As Elena rode the elevator down to the lobby, she realized that somewhere in the midst of restructuring community partnerships and challenging corporate assumptions, she had begun to care about Alexander Sterling in ways that went far beyond their professional relationship. The prospect both excited and terrified her, representing possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine since Miguel had left them struggling and alone. But Elena had learned to trust her instincts about people's character, and everything she'd observed about Alexander over the past months suggested that his feelings were genuine and his commitment was real. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about how to navigate a relationship that had the potential to transform both their lives in ways even more profound than the partnership that had brought them together. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in February when Elena arrived at Sterling Dynamics to find Alexander's office empty and Rebecca Chen pacing in the hallway with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Elena had never seen Rebecca look so shaken, her usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled anxiety that immediately set Elena on edge. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" Elena asked, setting down her coffee and approaching cautiously. Rebecca ended her call and turned to Elena with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here." Alexander collapsed at his apartment early this morning. "He's at Riverside General. They think it might be another cardiac episode, but more severe this time." Elena felt the world tilt slightly, the same disorienting sensation she'd experienced months ago when learning that the homeless man she'd saved was actually one of the most powerful people in the country. But this time, the fear was personal and immediate. Over the past months, Alexander had become more than just her employer or even a friend. He'd become someone whose well-being mattered to her in ways she was still learning to acknowledge. "How bad is it?" Elena asked, already reaching for her purse and coat. "They won't tell me much over the phone since I'm not family," Rebecca said, frustration evident in her voice. But his housekeeper found him unconscious in his study around 6 a.m. The paramedics said he was responsive by the time they arrived, but his heart rhythm was irregular. "Well?" Lena's mind immediately went to Sophia, who was safely at school but would need to be picked up at 3:30. Then she thought about the community partnership presentation scheduled for this afternoon, the board meeting on Thursday where she was supposed to present the quarterly impact report, the dozens of professional obligations that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to Alexander's health. "I'm going to the hospital," Elena said, not asking permission but simply stating her intention. "Elena, I don't think they'll let you see him," Rebecca said gently. "Hospital policies about non-family visitors are pretty strict, especially in cardiac units." But Elena was already walking toward the elevator, driven by the same instinct that had compelled her to stop on Charter Street months ago. Professional protocols and bureaucratic rules felt irrelevant when someone she cared about was in danger. At Riverside General, Elena navigated the familiar maze of hallways that she'd learned during her mother's final illness. The cardiac intensive care unit was on the 7th floor, protected by security doors and staffed by nurses who'd seen enough family crises to recognize genuine concern versus idle curiosity. "I'm here to see Alexander Sterling," Elena told the charge nurse, a middle-aged woman whose kind eyes suggested she understood that relationships often transcended legal definitions of family. "Are you a relative?" the nurse asked, following protocol while clearly hoping for a reason to be flexible. Elena hesitated for only a moment. "I'm Elena Ruiz. I work with him, but more than that, he's important to me. I'm the person who performed CPR on him last fall when he had his first cardiac episode." The nurse's expression changed immediately. "You're the woman who saved his life? He talks about you constantly." The doctors were just saying they wished someone who knew his recent stress levels could provide information about what might have triggered this episode. Within minutes, Elena found herself in a consultation room with Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the same cardiologist who treated Alexander after his first cardiac event. Dr. Hawkins looked exhausted, the kind of weariness that came from delivering difficult news to worried families. "Ms. Ruiz, I'm glad you're here," Dr. Hawkins said without preamble. "Alexander's condition is more serious than his previous episode. He's experiencing what we call unstable angina. His heart isn't getting adequate blood flow, and we're seeing significant electrical irregularities." Elena felt her throat tighten. "What does that mean? Is he going to be okay?" "That depends on several factors," Dr. Hawkins replied honestly. His previous cardiac event was triggered by the physical stress of his social experiment combined with underlying coronary artery disease. This episode appears to be related to severe emotional and psychological stress that's been building over time. Elena thought about Alexander's increased work hours over the past month, the way he'd been staying late to personally oversee every aspect of the community partnerships, his perfectionist tendencies when it came to proving that Sterling Dynamics could be a genuinely beneficial corporate citizen. He's been working obsessively," Elena said, "staying at the office until 10 or 11 p.m., coming in on weekends, personally reviewing every community partnership agreement. I've been worried about his stress levels, but he insisted he was fine." Dr. Hawkins made notes as Elena spoke. "That's consistent with what we're seeing. His body is essentially in a state of chronic stress response, which is extremely dangerous for someone with his cardiac history." "What are his options?" Elena asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. "Surgery," Dr. Hawkins said simply, "a triple bypass to restore proper blood flow to his heart. It's a serious procedure with significant risks, but without it, he's at extremely high risk for a massive heart attack that could be fatal." Elena stared at the medical chart Dr. Hawkins was holding, its clinical language spelling out the vulnerability of someone who'd seemed so powerful and in control just yesterday morning. "How soon?" Elena managed to ask. "Ideally, within the next 48 hours. We're stabilizing him now with medications, but that's only a temporary solution." Elena was allowed to see Alexander for 10 minutes, and the sight of him connected to monitors and IV lines in the sterile environment of the cardiac ICU brought back painful memories of her mother's final weeks. But where her mother had looked diminished by illness, Alexander looked frustrated and angry, clearly chafing against the forced inactivity and medical supervision. "Elena," he said immediately when she entered the room, his voice hoarse but determined, "you shouldn't be here. You have the Henderson School presentation this afternoon and the board meeting." "Stop," Elena interrupted, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "Just stop worrying about work for 5 minutes and focus on getting better." Alexander's expression softened as he looked at her face, seeing the worry she was trying to hide behind practical concern. "Dr. Hawkins told you about the surgery?" Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I need you to know something," Alexander said, reaching for her hand with fingers that felt cold despite the warm hospital room. "These months of working with you, of learning from you, of caring about you and Sophia, they've been the most meaningful of my life. But I also know I've been pushing myself too hard, trying to prove that I deserve the respect you've shown me." Elena felt tears she'd been holding back start to spill over. "Alexander, you don't have to prove anything to me. You don't have to earn caring through perfect performance." "I've been terrified," Alexander admitted quietly. "Terrified that if I slowed down or showed any weakness, you'd realize I'm not the person you thought I was. That you'd see me as just another privileged executive who talks about social responsibility but doesn't really understand what it means." Elena squeezed his hand, recognizing the insecurity behind his workaholic behavior. The person I care about isn't the CEO of Sterling Dynamics or the billionaire who can fund community programs. It's the man who admits when he's wrong, who listens when he doesn't understand, who cares enough about doing better that he works himself into cardiac episodes. Alexander smiled weakly. That's either very romantic or very pathological. Both, Elena said, surprising herself by laughing through her tears. Definitely both. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Dr. Hawkins entered with surgical consent forms and a timeline for the procedure scheduled for Thursday morning. I'll be here, Elena said immediately before Alexander could object. Sophia can stay with Carmen, and Rebecca can handle the office. I'll be here when you wake up. Elena, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Elena said firmly. Not because I owe you anything, and not because of our professional relationship. I'll be here because I care about you, and because people who care about each other show up during the difficult times. Alexander's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back since the ambulance ride that morning. I love you, he said simply, the words spoken with the clarity that sometimes comes from facing mortality. I know the timing is terrible and the circumstances are complicated, but I needed to say it. Elena felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I love you too, she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. And that's why you're going to get through this surgery and recover properly, even if I have to personally monitor your stress levels for the rest of your life. As visiting hours ended and Elena prepared to leave, she realized that their relationship had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Tomorrow would bring surgical risks and recovery challenges. But it would also bring the possibility of building something together that was based on genuine understanding rather than gratitude or professional obligation. Alexander Sterling was no longer just the man she'd saved on Charter Street or the employer who'd given her opportunities. He was someone she loved, and someone worth fighting for through whatever challenges lay ahead. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with Elena sitting in the preoperative waiting area at Riverside General at 5:30 a.m., 3 hours before Alexander's scheduled surgery. She'd barely slept, spending the night alternating between checking on Sophia, who was staying with Carmen for the week, and pacing their apartment while trying to distract herself with community partnership paperwork that she couldn't concentrate on. Now she clutched a thermos of coffee that had grown cold hours ago and watched the early shift nurses begin their rounds with practiced efficiency. Dr. Hawkins had explained that the triple bypass surgery would take between 4 and 6 hours, depending on what they discovered once Alexander was on the heart-lung machine. The procedure would involve harvesting healthy blood vessels from his leg and chest to create new pathways around the blocked arteries in his heart. It was complex, invasive, and carried risks that Elena tried not to think about too specifically. Ms. Ruiz? A voice interrupted her anxious thoughts. Elena looked up to see a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent blue eyes that looked remarkably familiar. I'm Catherine Sterling, Alexander's mother. Rebecca Chin told me I might find you here. Elena stood immediately, feeling awkward and uncertain about how to interact with someone from Alexander's family. They'd never discussed his mother beyond passing references to her involvement in Sterling Dynamics' charitable foundation, and Elena hadn't expected any of his relatives to acknowledge her presence at the hospital. Mrs. Sterling, Elena said, extending her hand formally. I'm Elena Ruiz. I work with Alexander at Sterling Dynamics. Catherine Sterling studied Elena's face with a kind of direct assessment that suggested she'd heard more about Elena than just her professional role. I know exactly who you are, my dear. You're the woman who saved my son's life, and more importantly, you're the woman who's been teaching him what it means to live meaningfully. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to respond to such direct acknowledgement of her personal relationship with Alexander. May I sit with you? Catherine asked, gesturing to the uncomfortable plastic chairs that Elena had been occupying since dawn. Waiting alone for surgery news is one of life's more challenging experiences. As they settled beside each other, Catherine continued, Alexander talks about you constantly, you know. About your work transforming Sterling Dynamics' community partnerships. About your daughter Sophia's academic achievements. About how you've helped him understand the difference between charity and justice. Elena wasn't sure what Alexander had shared with his mother about their evolving relationship, so she focused on safer professional territory. Your son has been very supportive of implementing more collaborative approaches to community engagement. He's willing to listen when his assumptions are challenged, which isn't as common as you might expect in corporate leadership. Catherine smiled knowingly. My dear, I've been watching Alexander struggle with the burden of inherited privilege for 47 years. He's always felt he needed to prove himself worthy of what he was given, which led to a kind of isolated perfectionism that I worried would eventually consume him. But these past months, since he's been working with you, I've seen him become more grounded, more authentic, more connected to something meaningful beyond corporate success. Elena found herself relaxing slightly in Catherine's presence. Despite her obvious wealth and social position, Catherine spoke with the same direct honesty that Elena appreciated in Alexander. "Can I ask you something personal?" Catherine said. "What are your intentions regarding my son?" The question was asked kindly but seriously, and Elena appreciated its directness. "Mrs. Sterling, I care about Alexander deeply, but I'm also very aware of the practical complications involved in our different backgrounds and circumstances. My first priority is always Sophia's stability and security. I can't afford to make romantic decisions that might jeopardize her well-being." "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say," Catherine replied immediately. "Someone who puts their child's needs first, who thinks carefully about long-term consequences rather than just following emotions, that's the kind of person I want in my son's life." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Hawkins, who approached in surgical scrubs to provide the final preoperative update. Alexander was being prepared for surgery and would be taken into the operating room within the next 30 minutes. "Can we see him briefly?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure whether her presence would be appropriate with his mother there. "Of course," Dr. Hawkins said, "but keep it short and positive. He needs to go into surgery with as little additional stress as possible." Alexander was in a preoperative room, looking pale but alert in a hospital gown that made him appear vulnerable in a way his expensive suits never had. When he saw Elena and his mother enter together, his expression brightened with surprise and obvious relief. "Mom, I didn't expect you to come," he said, accepting Catherine's gentle hug. "I told Rebecca not to worry you with this." "Alexander Sterling, you've been my primary worry for 47 years, Catherine replied with maternal firmness. "I'm certainly not going to stop now when you're having major cardiac surgery." Elena hung back slightly, wanting to give them private time but also needing to see Alexander before he went into the operating room. When Catherine stepped aside, Alexander reached for Elena's hand immediately. "How's Sophia handling this?" he asked, his first concern being for Elena's daughter rather than his own upcoming surgery. "She made you a get-well card," Elena said, pulling a construction paper creation from her purse. "She wanted me to give it to you before surgery for good luck." Alexander opened the card to reveal Sophia's careful 8-year-old handwriting. "Get better soon, Alexander. My mom needs you to be healthy so she can stop worrying all the time. Also, I want to show you my science project when you feel better. Love, Sophia." Elena watched Alexander's eyes fill with tears as he read Sophia's message. "She drew us as a family," Elena said quietly, pointing to the stick figures on the card's cover. "A tall man, a medium-sized woman, and a small girl all holding hands under a rainbow." "Elena," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion, "if something happens during surgery—" "Nothing is going to happen during surgery," Elena interrupted firmly. "You're going to get through this procedure, recover properly, and then we're going to have a serious conversation about work-life balance and stress management." Catherine smiled as she watched Elena's no-nonsense approach to her son's anxiety. "I can see why Alexander finds you so grounding," she said approvingly. The transportation team arrived to take Alexander to the operating room, and Elena felt her throat tighten as the reality of the next several hours hit her. She leaned down to kiss Alexander's forehead gently, a gesture that felt both intimate and natural. "I love you," she whispered, words that still felt new and significant. "I'll be right here when you wake up." "I love you too," Alexander replied, squeezing her hand one final time before the gurney began moving toward the surgical suite. As Elena and Catherine returned to the waiting area, Elena realized that the next few hours would test not just Alexander's physical resilience but also her own emotional strength and the foundation of the relationship they'd been building. The woman who'd once performed CPR on a stranger was now waiting for surgery results on someone who'd become essential to her understanding of love, partnership, and the possibility of building a future that honored both her independence and her capacity for deep connection. "Elena," Catherine said as they settled in for the long wait ahead, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens with Alexander, you and Sophia will always have family in me. You've given my son something I've been hoping he'd find his entire life. Someone who loves him for who he is rather than what he can provide." Elena felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over, not from fear but from gratitude for the unexpected family she'd found through one spontaneous act of kindness on a rainy night months ago. Outside the hospital windows, Riverside Heights continued its daily rhythm, but inside the surgical waiting room, two women from very different worlds discovered they shared the most important thing of all: love for someone worth waiting for, worth worrying about, and worth believing in through whatever challenges lay ahead. The surgery had begun, and Elena Ruiz settled in to demonstrate the same patient determination that had carried her through every other difficult period of her life, knowing that this time she wasn't facing uncertainty alone. 6 months later, on a perfect Saturday morning in early September, Elena stood in the garden of the house she now shared with Alexander and Sophia in the Riverside Heights suburbs, watching her daughter help Alexander plant a small vegetable patch that they'd designed together during his recovery. The modest colonial home struck the perfect balance between Alexander's means and Elena's values. Comfortable without being ostentatious, spacious enough for their blended family while remaining connected to the community where Elena had built her life. Alexander moved carefully as he worked, still mindful of the surgical restrictions that Dr. Hawkins had gradually lifted over the past months. The triple bypass surgery had been successful, but recovery had required a complete restructuring of his approach to work, stress, and life balance. Elena had been ruthlessly efficient in enforcing the cardiologist's recommendations, much to Alexander's initial frustration and eventual gratitude. "Mommy, look how big the tomatoes are getting." Sophia called from her assigned section of the garden, where she was tending plants with the same careful attention she brought to her schoolwork. At 9 years old, she'd grown 2 inches and gained a confidence that came from living in a stable, loving household where her needs were anticipated rather than constantly negotiated. "They're beautiful, mi amor," Elena replied, wiping her hands on the gardening apron that had been Alexander's first gift after returning home from the hospital, a practical present that acknowledged her preference for meaningful over expensive. The past 6 months had been a period of careful adjustment, as they learned to build a life together that honored both Elena's independence and their mutual commitment. Alexander had hired an additional executive to share the workload at Sterling Dynamics, finally accepting Elena's argument that martyrdom wasn't an effective leadership strategy. Elena had restructured the community relations department to operate with more autonomy, allowing her to maintain oversight while delegating daily operations to the capable team they'd assembled. Their engagement had been announced quietly, without fanfare or publicity, exactly as Elena had requested. The simple solitaire on her left hand had been chosen during a private shopping trip with Sophia, whose main requirement was that it shouldn't be so fancy that mommy feels like she can't wear it to work. The wedding was planned for October, a small ceremony in the garden they were now cultivating together. "Alexander," Elena said, settling beside him on the wooden bench he'd installed specifically for moments when they wanted to survey their small domain, "Catherine called this morning. She wants to confirm the menu for the rehearsal dinner." Alexander smiled at the mention of his mother, who had become Sophia's devoted grandmother and Elena's unexpected ally in managing his tendency toward overwork. Catherine Sterling had embraced her new family with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, particularly Elena, who had never imagined herself welcomed so warmly into circles of wealth and privilege. "What did you tell her?" Alexander asked, though he already knew Elena would have handled the conversation with her characteristic diplomacy. "That simple is better than elaborate, and that Sophia's excitement about her new dress is more important than impressing people we barely know," Elena replied. "Your mother actually agreed, which continues to surprise me." The wedding preparations had been a study in compromise, with Elena insisting on a guest list that included her neighbors from Willowbrook alongside Alexander's business associates and family friends. The menu would feature both Elena's mother's empanada recipe and Catherine's preferred caterer. Sophia would serve as maid of honor, a role she'd campaigned for with the determination of someone who understood she was gaining not just a stepfather, but a secure future. "Daddy Alexander," Sophia said, using the title she'd settled on after weeks of negotiation about what to call her mother's fiancé, "can we pick some tomatoes for lunch? I want to make that salad recipe you taught me." Elena watched Alexander's face light up at Sophia's request, the same expression of wonder that appeared whenever Sophia included him naturally in their family routines. The adjustment period had been easier than Elena had anticipated, partly because Alexander approached parenting with the same careful attention he brought to business decisions, and partly because Sophia had been ready for the stability and security he provided. "Of course," Alexander said, standing carefully and offering his hand to help Sophia up from where she'd been kneeling beside the pepper plants. "Elena, would you like to help us prepare a feast worthy of our hard work?" Their Saturday routine had evolved organically over the months. Gardening in the morning, simple lunch preparation together, afternoon activities that ranged from museum visits to neighborhood walks, quiet evenings with homework help and family conversation. It was a life that prioritized presence over productivity, connection over achievement. "I have something to tell you both," Elena said as they gathered vegetables in a basket Sophia had decorated with paintings of their family. Sterling Dynamics received the Community Partnership Award from the Riverside Heights Chamber of Commerce. The ceremony is next month, and they specifically requested that I accept the award since the nominating letters all mentioned the collaborative approach we've implemented. Alexander's pride was obvious, but Elena could see him consciously choosing not to make the moment about his company's success rather than her leadership. "That's incredible, Mommy," Sophia said, hugging Elena with tomato-stained hands. "You're going to be famous." "I'm going to be recognized for work I love," Elena corrected gently, "which is different from being famous, but much more satisfying." As they prepared lunch together in the kitchen that still felt new to Elena, a space large enough for Sophia to do homework while Elena cooked, with appliances that worked reliably and windows that looked out onto their garden, Elena reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed since that night on Charter Street. The community partnerships she'd developed at Sterling Dynamics had become a model that other corporations were studying and attempting to replicate. 3 different universities had invited her to speak about collaborative approaches to corporate social responsibility. Most importantly, the communities they served had reported measurable improvements in employment, education, and health outcomes. "Elena," Alexander said as they sat down to their simple lunch of garden salad and grilled chicken, "I have some news too. The board approved my proposal to establish the Elena Ruiz Foundation for Community Innovation. It will provide grants specifically for community-led solutions to local challenges, with you as the founding director." Elena paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, processing this unexpected announcement. "Alexander Sterling, did you just create a foundation and name it after me without asking?" "I may have," Alexander admitted, looking slightly nervous about her reaction. "But in my defense, it was the board's idea to use your name after they reviewed the success metrics from our current partnerships." Sophia looked between her parents with the expression of someone following a conversation that felt important but complex. "Is this good news or are you in trouble, Daddy Alexander?" Elena considered the foundation proposal, recognizing both the honor it represented and the responsibility it would entail. Leading a foundation meant expanding the work she'd begun at Sterling Dynamics, providing resources for communities to develop and implement their own solutions rather than accepting externally imposed programs. "It's good news," Elena said finally, "but it's also a conversation we should have had before you announced it to the board." "Fair point," Alexander conceded. "But Elena, this foundation could change how corporate philanthropy operates throughout the region. Communities would have direct access to funding for their own initiatives, with minimal bureaucratic oversight and maximum local control." Elena smiled at his enthusiasm, recognizing the man who'd fallen in love with the idea of genuine community partnership. "All right, Mr. Sterling, I'm interested. But the foundation operates according to community priorities, not corporate convenience." "Wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Ruiz." As afternoon settled into evening and Sophia worked on her homework while Elena and Alexander cleaned up from dinner, Elena felt the deep satisfaction of a life that had found its proper rhythm. The urgent desperation that had characterized her existence before meeting Alexander had been replaced by sustainable hope and genuine security. "Mommy," Sophia said from the kitchen table where she was working on a report about community helpers, "can I write about you for my school project?" "About how you help people by making sure big companies actually listen to regular people." Elena looked at her daughter's earnest face, thinking about how to explain that the work she did, facilitating partnerships between communities and corporations, was just one way of helping others, no more or less valuable than teaching children to read or serving coffee to tired customers or checking on elderly neighbors. "You can write about anyone who helps make their community better," Elena said. "But remember, mi amor, the most important helping happens in small ways, every day, when people choose kindness over convenience." As Elena tucked Sophia into bed that night in the room they decorated together with art supplies that Sophia could choose freely rather than carefully ration, Elena reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment of security and love. The woman who'd knelt on wet concrete to perform CPR on a stranger had become someone who could influence corporate policy and community development. The single mother who'd counted tips to afford school supplies had become someone who could provide her daughter with opportunities she'd only dreamed of. Most importantly, the person who'd helped someone in need without expecting anything in return had discovered that genuine kindness created its own rewards, often in forms more profound than anything that could have been anticipated. Outside Sophia's bedroom window, Riverside Heights sparkled with the lights of a community where Elena Ruiz had found not just a home, but a purpose that honored both her values and her capabilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to bridge the gap between corporate resources and community wisdom. But tonight, Elena fell asleep beside Alexander Sterling in their shared bed, listening to Sophia's peaceful breathing from the next room, surrounded by the kind of security and love that had once seemed as distant as the stars her daughter loved to count. The story that began with one spontaneous act of compassion had become a life built on sustained commitment to caring for others while being cared for in return. The brass nameplate on Elena's office desk still read Community Relations Coordinator, but it represented something much larger now, proof that sometimes helping a stranger can transform not just two lives, but entire communities, creating ripples of positive change that extend far beyond the original moment of human kindness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.